They are nearly gone now. In 2025, the youngest members of the Hitler Youth are well into their 90s, fading quietly into history in nursing homes across Germany. 80 years ago, however, these frail elders were the most fanatical soldiers on Earth, armed with anti-tank rockets they could barely lift. This story reveals what happened when the fighting stopped. When an entire generation raised to rule the world found themselves broken, defeated, and feared by the very adults who were supposed to protect them. The silence that followed lasted for decades, burying a trauma that is only now rising to the surface at the very end of their lives. Understanding modern Germany requires looking at its lost children. The end of the Third Reich resembled a schoolyard recess with bazookas rather than a military parade. On March 20th, 1945, just outside the Führer bunker, a trembling Adolf Hitler patted the cheek of Alfred Czech, a 12-year-old boy who had just received the Iron Cross. Alfred was typical of the time. By that spring, the German army had collapsed, leaving the defense of the capital to old men and children. Boys as young as 10 were pulled from their classrooms, shoved into oversized uniforms, and handed Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, with instructions to hold the line against the hardened Soviet Red Army. Thousands died in those final weeks, crushed under tank treads or cut down by snipers who couldn't believe they were shooting at elementary schoolers. It was a cynical sacrifice of a generation and a final act of cruelty from a regime that claimed to cherish them. When the surrender finally came in May, the Allies viewed these children as time bombs rather than victims. Joseph Goebbels had spent months broadcasting threats about Werwolf guerrilla units, fanatical youth squads trained to slit the throats of occupying soldiers and sabotage supply lines. The Werwolf program was mostly a propaganda bluff with little real-world impact, but the psychological effect was devastating. American and British troops were terrified of 15-year-olds. They treated captured Hitler Youth members as dangerous insurgents rather than misguided kids. Thousands were rounded up and thrown into makeshift detention camps, huddled in open fields behind barbed wire. The suspicion was absolute. If a Jeep tire blew out on a German road in 1945, the MPs looked for a teenager with a knife instead of a nail. This clash was most visible with the 12th SS Panzer Division, ironically nicknamed the Baby Division. These were elite volunteers raised on a diet of pure ideology rather than conscripted schoolboys, and they had fought with a ferocity that stunned veteran Allied units in Normandy. When they surrendered, the reality of their age became undeniable. American guards found themselves running POW camps that felt more like juvenile detention centers, confiscating toys along with daggers. Re-education officers faced the nightmare scenario of deprogramming 16-year-olds who had known nothing but Nazism since they were 4. They forced the boys to watch films of the concentration camps, expecting tears or guilt. Instead, many of the youths just stared blankly, convinced the footage was Hollywood trickery faked by their captors. By 1946, the Allies realized they couldn't keep an entire generation behind bars forever. Germany lay in ruins, and someone had to clear the rubble. General Lucius Clay, the American deputy governor, argued that children born after 1919 had been denied the chance to know anything else beyond Hitler's world. This led to the Youth Amnesty of 1946 and 1947. In a massive bureaucratic wave, thousands of young people were given a Persilschein, a laundry ticket, or clean slate. Unless they were classified as major war criminals, their records were wiped. It was a pragmatic decision rather than a moral one. The West needed manpower to rebuild and a buffer against the Soviet Union. As a result, millions of indoctrinated youths walked free, told simply to go home, forget the past, and be good Democrats. In the Soviet occupation zone, however, re-education took a different shape. The Soviets wanted the youths to become communists rather than just ceasing to be Nazis. On March 7, 1946, the Free German Youth, or FDJ, was founded. For many boys, the transition was smooth. They traded their brown shirts for blue ones. But the songs, the marching, the flags, and the campfire camaraderie remained exactly the same. Erich Honecker, who would later lead East Germany, built the FDJ to channel that youthful energy into building socialism. It worked. A generation that felt lost and defeated suddenly found a new cause that promised them a future. They avoided confronting their past indoctrination by swapping one authoritarian father figure for another, marching for Stalin with the same precision they had learned marching for Hitler. In West Germany, the 1950s became the decade of aggressive forgetting. The economic miracle demanded total focus on the future, on Volkswagens and new apartments, not on the dark memories of 1945. The Hitler Youth generation, now young adults, threw themselves into careers and marriages with a desperate intensity. They didn't talk about the friends they saw die in Berlin, nor did they talk about the fanaticism they had felt. They buried it under hard work. Psychological researchers later called this the collective silence. Parents never mentioned the war to their children born in the 50s. An unspoken pact existed. If we don't look back, the nightmares can't catch us. The trauma never vanished. It just went underground, festering in a society that was outwardly prosperous but inwardly hollow. As the decades passed, this generation began to take power. Helmut Kohl, who would become the Chancellor of Reunification, coined a famous phrase to describe their situation: the mercy of late birth. Born in 1930, Kohl had been a member of the Hitler Youth. He was even sworn in at Berchtesgaden in April 1945, but he was just young enough to escape the worst guilt of the Holocaust. This phrase became a shield for his peers. It allowed them to acknowledge their presence in the organization without accepting the culpability of the adult perpetrators. Politicians like Hans-Dietrich Genscher, who served as a teenage anti-aircraft helper, used this narrative to reintegrate Germany into the world. They were the flak helper generation, positioning themselves as the first victims of the regime's seduction rather than villains. The silence couldn't last forever. In the late 1960s, the children of the Hitler Youth generation, the baby boomers, started asking the questions their parents had avoided. "Daddy, what did you do in the war?" transformed from an innocent query into an accusation. The student protests of 1968 went beyond Vietnam or university rules to become a direct confrontation with the father generation. The students saw the authoritarian streaks in their parents, the obsession with order, the emotional coldness, and connected it straight back to the Third Reich. It was a brutal intergenerational conflict. The former Hitler Youth members, who felt they had rebuilt the country from ashes, were horrified to be called Nazis by their own long-haired children. The dinner table became a battlefield where the repressed past finally exploded. The secrets kept coming out, even half a century later. In 2006, the literary world was stunned when Günter Grass, Germany's moral conscience and a Nobel Prize winner, admitted a dark truth. For decades, he had scolded the nation for not facing its past, yet he had hidden his own service in the Waffen-SS. At 17, he hadn't just been a flak helper, he was a tank gunner in the 10th SS Panzer Division. The revelation shattered his reputation as a moral authority. Critics asked how he could have judged others so harshly while remaining silent about his own uniform for 60 years. Grass claimed he had been ashamed, that the memory was a burden he couldn't lift. His story proved that for the Hitler Youth generation, the clean slate of 1946 never really wiped away the stain. An even bigger shock occurred when details emerged about a young Joseph Ratzinger, the man who became Pope Benedict XVI. The media frenzy was intense, with tabloids screaming about the Nazi Pope. The truth was more complex and even more telling of the era. Ratzinger hadn't volunteered. He was conscripted into the Hitler Youth at 14 because the law required it. Later, he was drafted into an anti-aircraft unit protecting a BMW plant. His story wasn't one of fanaticism, but of trapped passivity. He deserted in April 1945, risking execution to return home. When he died in 2022, his obituary had to wrestle with this fact. His life embodied the central defense of his generation, that they were cogs in a machine they didn't build, enrolled against their will in a tragedy they couldn't stop. In the 2020s, the final bill is coming due. Geriatric psychiatrist Hartmut Radebold, who pioneered research on Kriegskinder, or war children, discovered a disturbing trend in German nursing homes. As these men and women entered their 90s, the cognitive control they used to suppress their memories began to fail. Dementia often strips away the recent past, leaving only the oldest, deepest memories intact. Caregivers report elderly patients screaming during thunderstorms because the thunder sounds like Allied bombers. Others hoard food under their mattresses, terrified of the starvation they faced in 1945. The collective silence that held for 70 years is breaking down in the dementia wards. The trauma was never healed. It was just waiting. The terrified children of 1945 are back, surfacing in the bodies of the dying. We stand at the very edge of living memory. A boy who was 10 years old when he marched in the Jungvolk in 1940 is 95 today. In a few short years, no one will remain on earth who can tell you what it felt like to sing the Horst Wessel song by a campfire, or what it felt like to watch the Reichstag burn. The Hitler Youth generation is transforming from a group of people into a chapter in a history book. Their legacy remains uncomfortable. They built the stable, democratic Germany we know today, yet they carried the darkest ideological virus of the 20th century in their veins. They were the most indoctrinated generation in history, and their final act has been a long, slow struggle to outlive their own childhoods. Historians still debate how to classify them. Were they victims of child abuse on a national scale, brainwashed by a cult state, or were they complicit perpetrators who kept the war going long after it was lost? The answer is likely both. Alfred Check, the boy with the Iron Cross, spent his life answering fan mail from people who saw him as a hero and hate mail from those who saw him as a Nazi. He saved 12 German soldiers before being wounded, but he also fought for a regime that murdered millions. This duality defines the Hitler Youth. They were innocent children whom the state turned into guilty weapons. We can pity them for what was done to them, but we cannot ignore their actions. The ultimate fate of the Hitler Youth lay not in the camps or the nursing homes, but in the classrooms of modern Germany. The country learned the hard lesson that you cannot leave the moral formation of children to the state alone. Today, German students visit concentration camps as a civic duty rather than punishment. They study the mechanisms of propaganda so they can recognize the signs that their great-grandparents missed. The ghost of the Hitler Youth hangs over the German education system, a constant warning of how easily youthful idealism can be hijacked. The fanaticism of the 1930s occurred not because German children were monsters, but because they were normal children, desperate to belong, who were given a monstrous purpose. In April 2025, the Claims Conference released a report noting that the population of Holocaust survivors is diminishing rapidly, and the same clock ticks for the former Hitler Youth. When the last one passes, the direct link to the Third Reich will break forever. The opportunity to ask them why will vanish. We will only have their recorded testimonies, their fading photographs, and the warnings they left behind. The story of the Hitler Youth ends not with a sudden event, but with the quiet passing of old men and women who spent 80 years trying to understand the first 15 years of their lives. The children of the swastika are almost gone, leaving us with the terrifying truth that they were just children after all. The tragedy of the Hitler Youth is a universal warning about the fragility of youth, rather than just a German story. It shows that there is no instinct for freedom that cannot be crushed by indoctrination, and no innocence that cannot be weaponized. As we bid farewell to this generation in 2025, we must remember that every child is a vessel waiting to be filled. Ensuring they are filled with empathy instead of hate falls to us. If you found this history compelling, please like and subscribe for more explorations of the past.